Okay, my watch says it's 11 o'clock, so we will start. I'm Ray Hilborn at the University of Washington, and this is a webinar that's going to try to introduce you to the RAM Legacy Stock Assessment Database and potentially look at some of the features of the database and the website. The database is the existing published documentation is this paper here with Dan Ricard as the lead that came out in 2011. I think we are working on an update of a paper, but this is an online update for everybody who's interested in using it. Next slide, Daniel. So that this database had its beginnings with Ram Myers, who in the 1990s was the first person to synthesize a large number of existing stock assessments into a stock assessment database. From 2007 to 2009, Boris Worm and I led an NC's working group, and part of that working group was to develop a database of fishery stock assessments to try to understand what the trend in the status of fish stocks was in a way that was more reliable than simply looking at catch trends. Since about 2013, that database has been housed here at the University of Washington, and we've continued to expand its coverage so that we now have 1,372 individual stocks covered, and there are 2,198 assessments included. Many stocks are reassessed, so a lot of stocks have different assessments in time. Next slide, please. This is a map that you'll see again, and you'll see on the website, that shows the coverage of the database. The size of the circles is the catch, the landings reported to FAO by individual countries, and what's shaded in green is how much of that catch is represented in the RAM Legacy Stock Assessment Database. What you see is that most of the North Atlantic is particularly well covered. The European countries, ICES countries, you see down the Mediterranean, it's less than half. North America, pretty good coverage. South America, Peru, Chile, Argentina are pretty well covered. In addition, Japan over on the far right is well covered. Russia is about 50%. But the big outstanding gaps are Southeast Asia, where you have large fishing countries with lots of fish caught, but so far no stock assessments that we've brought into this database, except the little shaded green areas are high seas tuna fisheries, the main tuna species. Next slide, please. Just a quick overview. Daniel's going to run you through some more detail on this. We have, for each stock, we have metadata of the stock name, the assessment organization, taxonomy, area, region. We have a link to shape files for many of these stocks showing their range. A management authority, the years present in the time series data, and the type of assessment model. Next slide. So for the core of it, where it really came from is desires to have time series of catch, landings or discards, biomass, and recruitment. So the original RAM Legacy database was basically spawning stock biomass and recruitment. And so we've expanded that quite a bit. We now have, where available, TAC, advised catch. We have CPUE or survey data in some cases, exploitation rates or fishing mortality rates, and the status of the stock relative to reference points for biomass, exploitation rate, and fishing mortality rate. Next slide. And then we also have tables of some biological parameters: natural mortality rate, agent maturity, agent selectivity, where available, MSY, BMSY, UMSY, and spawner recruit steepness. Okay, next slide. We'll go through, this is where the website where it's contained, www.ramlegacy.org. And next slide is, so I'm going to pass it on to Daniel now, who's going to run you through the bulk of it. But as I say, if questions arise, send them via chat with your name and the question, and we will work through them at the end of the presentation. So Daniel Hively is the database manager, I think, for the last 6 years. So he's been largely responsible for updating the website, expanding its coverage, and he will run you through the website and the database.
Okay. So to start with, we're going to go over how we actually get the data into the database. So for the most part, we've had stock assessments shown on the right here as an example one that have been parsed through and then manually entered into input template file that we have that houses the different types of data that we take into RAM. So as you can see from this document, there's sort of a lot of different ways the data can come in from the assessment. There's figures, there's some tables, some text that might need to be parsed. So in terms of what actually is getting entered in, we have several tabs in our input file. To start with, we have our metadata related to both the stock and the assessment. So any general information that has to do with when the assessment was done, the citation, anything like that, and then general stock information that may change between assessments. And in terms of the data itself, we've broken it up into several tabs. The first is catch related, so time series, parameters, any information about the time series and parameters. So maybe if the fishery was shut down, that might explain why maybe there's 0 values in a time series for a given time. So we try to have as much information available as possible for the data that we get entered in. We have a similar tab for status. So we get parameters, time series, and general information. And then any time series that are not covered by these tabs, they can be entered in as a new column field. So we try to take in as much data as possible, anything that's available that would be important. And then sort of our last tab is our catch-all for our parameters. So anything that wouldn't be covered from the prior tabs would be available here. So we have information such as MSY, habitat, anything else that wouldn't necessarily fit in the other tabs, since those are generally tied to specific time series. So to actually put the data in there, here's an example of a table, which we generally is how we're getting these time series. And in this case, it's nice since it shows a bunch of different types of time series. So we would take, say, fishing pressure, as shown here, and just plop it right into the column over there. And since we also get some age data there, we can fill that in as well. Similarly for our parameters, so here's a reference point associated with that time series. We have a nice table here with all that front loaded. We can plop that in as well. So tables is how we generally get most of our information. In some cases, we might need to pull it out of a figure. So we would need to use some plot digitizer software to extract that time series, which gives a pretty good approximation of what the time series is, but obviously a table would be preferable. And then some parameters need to be parsed through text to extract, so they wouldn't necessarily be in a table. But for the most part, that's the process of extracting from an assessment. Whereas more recently, we've been able to start getting bulk imports of assessments from certain regions, such as United States, ICs, Mediterranean, Japan. We can get up to hundreds of assessments at once, and we used to use custom code to extract that data into RAM so that we don't have to fit or make a template for each of the several hundred different assessments. And then the other nice thing about this is it's generally output straight from an assessment. So input error tends to be a lot less in these cases, but and it's also nice to get a lot of data at once. So once that data is actually in RAM, we generate some supplemental data to accompany it. So an example of that would be we have a term TC best, which is our total catch best approximation. So if someone just wants to find the best representation of catch for a stock and they don't want to parse through all the different time series, TC best would be a way to just front load that. And so it would first look for total catch, and then it would look for total landings. And then if there's nothing else there, then that field will be blank. So it's just a way to see if the catch is there or if it's not. And if it is there, it's just nice and available. Another form of supplemented data would be a really simple calculation. So if we had a BMSY and a UMSY, we can do a calculated version of MSY. And so there's that little tag on the end there indicating that it was calculated and didn't come straight from the assessment. But since it's a basic calculation, it's still appropriate to fit in there. But it is still differentiated with that little tag there. So once all that data is generated and available, we start putting it into our different tables. So we have our metrics tables, which just explains the different types of data that we have. So all the different kinds of parameters, all the different kinds of time series, and all the different kinds of metadata, some of which Ray covered earlier. There'd be an appropriate table for each of those. So if someone wanted to see what the area ID was for a stock, they could find it and see what the actual area name is. And then the metadata itself gets covered in our stock and assessment tables, which covers all these different sorts of things for each particular stock and assessment. And there's generally several different assessments per stock. So some of these fields can change between assessments. So an area might collapse or it might branch out. So whatever's most recent will be displayed in the metadata tables. And then for the actual data itself, we have all our parameters and time series, but we also have a views version, which I'll go over in the next slides, which is a way that we have a sort of simplifying what's available so that you don't have to go through a large data dump. So the data tables themselves, all the data is available. It's indicated by assessment, and just every single thing is shown. So if something is in RAM, it's going to be in the bioparams or time series tables. Whereas the views tables, it looks at selected data types, which are generally the most used or just the most commonly found. Data is indicated by stock. So for each particular time series or parameter, whatever is most recent will be displayed. So here's just an example of, let's say, the time series table. It's just all the different time series indicated by our assessment ID. So our unique identifier for an assessment, just every single time series. Whereas our views, there's specific time series that we display, and it's indicated by our stock ID, so our unique identifier per stock. And each of these fields will come from whatever the most recent assessment is that has that data. So different columns can come from different assessments. And so we have supplemental views tables, which show the source of each of the fields, the time, the assessment that it came from, any notes associated with that data. So any information about that, either time series or bioparameter, since we have views tables for both of these, any information will be available in those supplemental views tables. So all the information is sort of nice and upfront there. So once all that data gets generated, we have our sort of set of files that we generate for each new version. We have an Excel file. We have an R data file with a set of R loader files. Our stock summary files, which I'll go over later on when I go over the website, since those are also on there. We have a set of RAM documentation files, which goes over the RAM structure, what each of the fields means in the tables, how certain data gets generated, what the preference hierarchy is for some of the data generation. So anything that someone generally might have questions about, we try to cover in the documentation files. And then we also have an access file, which is available on request, since it gets pretty big and it adds up to a lot of storage space if we upload all of it. So that one's just sort of on request and not generally up on the website. So here's the sort of general website itself. I'm going to go over some of the graphics on the website, and then I'll actually look at the website itself. So on our front page, we have some summary files. Ray went over this one earlier. We also have two other general files showing our biomass trends and our fishing mortality trends across the different regions that's covered by RAM. And these are actually output from a state space model, which Mike is going to cover in a little bit when I get to another set of state space generator files, which uses the same set of data. So this just shows basically what's going on in each of the regions based on the data that's in RAM for biomass and fishing mortality. So on the regional portion of the website, we have a set of summary graphics. The first one is biomass coverage, which shows basically which years are covered across the different stocks in a region. We have two versions of this, one being this one, which just shows everything, and each of the stocks is indicated by a colored line, which is tied to its taxonomic group. We have another version which actually has all the stocks labeled, and that can cover several different graphics depending on the number of stocks, since it can get pretty cluttered otherwise. And now for this graphic, Mike will take over, since this is also output from the state-space model mentioned earlier.
All right. The goal here was to quantify a trend across all the stocks in each region for relative fishing pressure and relative biomass, relative to management targets or MSY values. The problem was that different stocks had different years of data available in those regions. So when we tried to summarize the data across those stocks, we ran into issues of data availability rather than the actual data values. Coylin Minto from the Galway Institute in Ireland put together a state space model which separates out components of uncertainty into process error and observation error to try to address that. Here, the process error, the process is a random walk of the regional mean in either U to UMSY or B to BMSY. And then individual stocks are treated as observations around that. So this allows us to account for that incomplete coverage of some stocks in some years. As an example of that, you can see in the figure off to the left, the red points show the medians of the data. And in that last year, we see a pretty high value and that's just because the few stocks that were included happened to have high values. But the state-based model, the orange line, it smooths out that error around there. The graph off to the right shows the similar trend across the region for biomass, and we have similar figures posted for other regions on the website. Thanks.
Okay. Another one of our regional graphics is showing the annual surplus production of the 4 stocks with the highest average biomass in a region. So just showing what's going on with the 4 big stocks generally per region. And then we have similarly for, in this case, the 4 stocks that contribute the most to surplus production in a region, we have a productivity versus biomass plot showing what's going on across time, indicated by the coloring over here. And then the other sort of big item on the regional page is the stock summary file, which is also present in the database release. It is a summary of all the stocks in a particular region. There's a table of contents at the beginning listing all the stocks and also displaying what some of the preferences are across the reference points. And so one thing to note, there's going to be a lot of IDs and terms here, which you might not be, we probably won't be familiar with. It's unique to RAM. Don't worry too much about that. That's can be covered in the documentation, and the website also has a glossary. So I'm just going to be going over sort of generally what's present here. So we have a general metadata table just indicating general information about the stock. A particular note is the assessment years that are available in RAM, and then just other general information like assessor and management authority. Then in terms of the actual data that's there, we have if the data is there, what its identifier is in RAM, which assessment year, the most recent assessment year that we have for that data, as well as the value. And then for some of the time series, we also have some sex and age data associated with that. So from here, we can see if there's gaps that if someone that's familiar with the region can notice that maybe they know that there's data available for something that's missing here, we can get that filled in. Or if they see that only an older assessment of that, and that they know that a more recent assessment has that data as well, we can fill that in. So it's just a way to sort of front load what we have in RAM. And we also have some plots showcasing that as well. we have several plots for the different time series, the big time series that we look for, as well as the reference points associated with that. So each of these plots looks at the most recent assessment that has that time series. And then if there's also reference points available from that assessment, they get plotted as dotted lines along there. So each of these can come from different assessments. So as I'm pointing out here, this F is available from 2011, whereas these other series are coming from 2013. So in this case, 2013 assessment just doesn't have an F time series. And similar to here, some more time series that we look for, and whether or not there's certain reference points associated with them. And then in this last graphic, there's a lot going on compared to the others. So we have our COBE plots up here, which is looking at our biomass and U relative to either MSY preferred like here, or a management target preferred over here. So in this case, blue is going to indicate the start year and red will indicate the new year, the most recent year, I should say. And so we can see that in this case, the spawning stock has been going sort of down over time until it's come over here. And similarly for our use, our fishing pressure or exploitation rate, it's been going up before settling back down over here. And then we also have similar plots for our spawner recruit relationship, so our SSB and recruits, and for our surplus production to biomass. And again, each of these can come from different assessments, and it's indicated by this tag over here, which is shows the year range. So it's the part of our assess ID, but most importantly, it shows the year that it came from on the end there. And so lastly, let's look at the actual website itself. So we have our main site, which has those summary graphics I went over earlier. There's also some general information, so just citations, acknowledgements, and so on. If we look at our regional pages, we have, it's slowly loading. Well, it'll have a listing of all the different regions that are available. And then for each of those, it'll also house those graphics that we went over earlier. And there's also some download links for if you want all the particular summary plots for a region, they'll be available. And if you want the stock summary plot, it's available there as well. Here we go. So looking at the region I was looking at in the PowerPoint, we get an explanation of the different graphics, and we get a download of those graphics. So these ones that we covered, and then the stock summary file can also be downloaded as well as just looked at on the site. And again, this is also available in the zip file that the new version of RAM will come in. We have the glossary that I mentioned before, which covers all the different terms that get referred to across the different graphics and pages on the website. To actually download the website, we are now housing it through Zenodo. And hopefully this comes up quickly. And not only is the current version hosted, we have older versions as well. So if work was done on a previous version of RAM and someone wants to check that out again, they can just download that. Right now, it's just a subset of them, more getting added. And just a note that older versions will have errors in them since they've been fixed in subsequent versions. So keep that in mind. But the most recent version is also always available on there. And then the other important website is our GitHub, which is what we use to track issues or additions. So if an issue is identified, it can be submitted through here. If a new assessment is identified, it can be submitted. Or if there's data that someone knows is available for an assessment that is not present in RAM, that can also be put on here. So anything that can get added or updated on RAM, an issue gets added here and it gets put into the queue for the next version of the RAM database. And so this final slide, I will take it back over to Ray.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Daniel and Mike. So just a few closing comments. We don't really try to filter these assessments for quality. So if an agency produces an assessment and it's publicly available, in general, we will put it up unless it goes through a review process and gets rejected. So we can't obviously provide guarantees for the quality of any of these assessments. We, along with many others, have used in many cases the assessment outputs and pretended they're data. There's obviously problems with that, but that's much too complicated for us to go through here. What you can do to help us is to, if you know anything about a particular stock and it's in the database and you see something you think is wrong with it, let us know through the GitHub site. If you know of assessments that are available but not in the database, definitely let us know. Ideally, you could either send us the documents. We have staff could take those and put them in, or if you know the assessment, it's always better for you to do the to fill out the data entry form, because we're always eager to new assessments or additional fields that aren't in existing assessments. So as I mentioned, we're going to in the original announcement of this, we're going to do this webinar again in some different time zones. So I see we do have some Europeans who are online here. I haven't been able to see if we have anyone from Asia, Australia, New Zealand, that part of the world. But tell your friends and colleagues about that. We'll send out another announcement for some new times. And with that, I think I'll pass it to Nicole to give us any questions that have come up, and we'll see who can best respond to them.
Yeah, so if anybody has a question, if you could please type it in the chat box. And also, if you hadn't had a chance to put where you're calling from, now would be a good time to do that as well. But we don't have any questions right now, so I guess we'll just wait a few minutes to see if any come in.
Okay, we can wait.
Okay. So here's one from Yutaro Sakai, a postdoc at Arizona State University. Am I right to understand that the latest stock assessment data is 2012, and for many stocks, it's up to the early 2000s?
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
Oops. Daniel?
Oh, yeah. The actual newest version of RAM was releases here and covers assessments up through 2018.
Yeah. Now, for some stocks, we may not have access to an assessment since 2012. It all depends on both the agencies and our connections with those agencies. So we have collaborators in most of the countries, the bigger countries that have lots of assessments, and one of their tasks is to keep us informed of new assessments. But so there are certainly some that don't go past 2012, but most of them go into 14, 15, 16, 17. Very few in 18, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all we have at the moment.
All we have. Does anyone want to ask a question? Just, we got vocally, turn your mic on and ask the question. Identify yourself.
Yeah, here's another one from Kai. Does the sparse coverage in Southeast Asia and Pacific mean there are no assessments done in those regions? And relatedly, Arnie Magnuson says, any likelihood to get more Asian data in the future?
Well, I mean, there are relatively few assessments done in Asia that are made public. Where, we're always looking. If you know of some, we are really eager to have them. They do have to be public, because this is a public database, and we have correspondents in India, China, Indonesia, and we're working with them to try to see what we can put up. But at present, other than the tuna fisheries, we have essentially nothing from Southeast Asia, and that is the big place that we're going to be devoting a lot of energy in the next couple years. But we're looking for help if anyone can provide it. I should say, with the exception of Japan. Japan is pretty well covered. It has an automated database system we can draw from, and Hiroyuki Kurota has been our man in Japan for quite some while and been helping us get connected to the Japanese assessments.
Yep. So then the next question is, if someone has a data set to contribute to RAM Legacy, what is the process of doing so?
So there's really two approaches. One is to send us a document, and we can do everything. Or the other, the preferred choice, is to download the input template and put in what you know, because if one of our staff who knows nothing about the stock, it's more likely that we'll misinterpret the assessment document than somebody who knows about the stock. But any assessment documents we're happy to receive.
Yeah, so is the link to download the template available on the website for people to fill out?
It should be available on the website and in the database, the zip file. Although I should say, for if it's a bulk, if it's a large amount of data coming in, it wouldn't maybe make more sense to. So for when we've done it in the past, we haven't done the templates for the bulk entry. We've just had a consistent format of the data, be it an Excel file or an R table, just something that's consistent and easily identified that can map onto RAM. So filling out a template would be good to show what kind of data is available from that database. But the bigger item would be being able to really identify what data is in there, and make sure that we can map it onto RAM without too much difficulty.
Okay, yeah. And Kelly's just put in the chat that the link for the template is located on the Access the Database page. So if people could look there. We've got a question from Carl at UBC. Some new assessments look at time varying natural mortality. Is there an entry option for those estimates?
So anything time varying, we would just map in as a time series. We don't have too many natural mortality time varying items, but the capacity is certainly there for it.
Yeah, that's that is one of the big assessment issues, is that most assessments assume a constant natural mortality rate, and increasingly people are recognizing and in some cases starting to use in assessments time varying natural mortality. So we certainly want to respond to that, and we'd love to get some assessments that have that in it.
And similar to that point, we're also allowing at age data to be incorporated. So we haven't yet formalized an entry template, but we're increasingly allowing catch at age, biomass at age, etc. So we can import matrices of data that vary by age and time.
Okay, and then we've got another question from Lisa Max, which is, do you have confidence scores or measures associated with each assessment in the database?
And the answer to that is no. We just haven't figured out how you would do that yet. So we don't do that. But it'd be good to do, but we haven't done it.
It's a hard problem. Different assessment models will produce different kinds of uncertainty around their estimates of biomass or fishing mortality. And those estimates of uncertainty will also depend on what parameters were included in the model. So it's a hard problem to standardize that. And we haven't really gone down that road.
That's all the questions for now.
I have one then. And that is increasingly a number of at least agencies are using an ensemble approach. They may have model A, B, and C. How do we deal, like I'm thinking Atlantic bluefin tuna. How do we deal with multiple assessments of the same stock at the same time?
So for right now, I think we have maybe 1 or 2 examples of that. It would just be the data associated with a particular model. So I think the case that we've had, there has been a preferred model that's been done. And so that has been what's used. But in terms of if there's several done and they're all accepted, I think the best way to do that would just be to have an assess ID associated with each one. And then we would just have to expand the unique identifier since these same years would be covered.
Yeah.
There has been times in the past where we've come close to having the same years covered between assessments for the same stock. So that is something that we should look into.
Okay, and then we've got another question from John Warrenchuk. How would you fit salmon assessments in here?
We do have a lot of assessments, salmon assessments. I mean, several hundred, I believe. They are not particularly up to date. We drew them out of a database that Randall Peterman had put together, and what was her, a postdoc that worked with him for many years. So basically, you've got sort of in your basic salmon data would be spawning stock, recruitment, and catch. I mean, that would be the core, and that really goes back to the data set that Ram Myers started. I think I know Curry Cunningham has been, through an NC's working group, has been assembling a lot more updated assessments, and I don't think we've got those in yet. Do we, Daniel?
No, and in fact, I think he was at some point also going to some subset of the salmon stocks we have, I think, have some age issues that weren't identified in the initial release that he was going to resolve. So that's something to follow up on too as well.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question from Julie that says, if you could go over the FFMSY summary plot from the website, it seems counterintuitive that red would be described as many experiencing overfishing in the figure title, as the legend indicates red is associated with low values of FFMSY.
Which graphic was this one?
The summary plot from the website for F over FMSY.
Oh, is this the one that covers all the regions?
Yeah, the mapping one that's on that's
Daniel, if you click on that, it'll open a new window, so it won't change.
Okay, there you go. That's the one.
Yeah.
Oh, I think the scale is incorrect then.
Let me see.
Yeah.
Thank you for pointing that out, Julie. Yeah, it looks like we swapped the color scale on this figure. It might have been taken from the biomass figure, which would use that color scale.
Oh, yep.
Although I'm a little puzzled. Yeah, okay, no. Okay, yeah, I think it's just a question of the legend is incorrect.
Let's see, looking at the biomass one, yeah. So, yeah,
Yeah. Okay, very good point.
Thank you, Julie. And then we have another question from Andres. It says, you mentioned that you have age at maturity for some stocks. You have one value per stock, or you also have time series of maturity estimates?
Of that particular parameter, I don't think we have time varying data for it.
And I think it's typically the age at 50% maturity. So it's not actually a maturity schedule. It's just a general indication of the age at maturity.
Currently. And much like we're looking into increasing our coverage of at-age matrices, we will also be looking into ways to increase our coverage of at-age vectors of parameters such as age at maturity.
I should mention another place that we're really eager to get better connections is Russia. That we have very few assessments from, certainly from Pacific Russia. Most of the big Russian stocks in the West are joint with ICES. But if anyone has a good connection in Russia, we've been turned down by almost everybody who works for the Russian government. So we're eager to find a good Russian contact, probably a Russian expatriate who's still well connected with the Russian system. Any more, Nicole?
Nope, not at the moment.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for dialing in. We had quite a few more people than I thought we would have, and we'll send out another set of announcements for some future dates and times. And if you have more questions, send them in. Probably best to send them to Nicole, and she'll decide whether it's best for me or Mike or Daniel or all of us.
Yeah, I can type my email in the chat here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I had her email wrong in the initial announcement. Okay, I think we can call that the end of the thing. And thanks again for calling in.